So, I mean, you've following closely the counterterrorism, in particular in Afghanistan and in the Middle East and all in that part of the world. So you raise a question that there is a less popular, known topic about the Russian involvement in Afghanistan. In particular, what is that? What we need to know about that?
Well, in Afghanistan, according to the U.S., we have some of the most important terrorist organizations and some organizations that we refer to as the violent extremist organizations. And there's a differentiation between the two of them. For example, there's a branch of the Islamic State, or ISIS, in Afghanistan that's called ISKP, Islamic State in Khorasan province, which is a terrorist organization according to the US. Also, there's the Taliban. The Taliban are not considered a terrorist organization. They are considered a violent extremist organization. What is happening today in Afghanistan is the Afghan government is fighting both of these groups and some other smaller groups. However, the Russians are now coming in and trying to reconcile with the Taliban. And the Russian rationale is that ISKP is a threat to Russia and Central Asian states such as Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, whereas the Taliban are not a threat to Russia, which is a fact. The Taliban are more of a nationalistic organization, meaning what? They do acts of terror, but they do it within the context of Afghan state. They do not go beyond the Afghan state, whereas ISKP is an internationalist terrorist organization. The Taliban are fighting these groups. So what Russia is looking at is supporting the Taliban diplomatically and also perhaps sending some arms to keep a diplomatic relationship, if you want. So on one hand, they are correct in saying that the Taliban are fighting ISIS and therefore, and it's in the advantage of Russia. The problem arises that the Taliban are also fighting the Afghan state. So supporting the Taliban actually destabilizes the Afghan state. And in the US policy is to set up an Afghan government that is strong enough to hold the security of Afghanistan. The US is not against negotiations with the Taliban, but it is against supporting the Taliban, specifically militarily or even politically outside of this process that's going on. The main groups that are affiliated with the ISKP are the Uzbeks, the two, which I mentioned, the two major Uzbek parties, but there are also some Chechens. IMU, the Islamic Movement of Uzbekistan, traditionally was based in Pakistan, but the Pakistanis were pushing them out from the frontier regions of Pakistan. So they came into Afghanistan, and there they were fighting the Taliban. So now they're being pushed northward, which is for Russia, that's a threat. And it's also for countries such as Uzbekistan and Tajikistan. So the radicalization is not happening within Afghanistan. There are very few people within Afghanistan who are being radicalized to the ISKP. The Taliban are radical enough, but they're gathering more of the Afghan support. So these foreigners, Uzbeks, Tajiks, Chechens are not that many, but there are some. They are obviously a threat to the stability of Central Asia, of Afghanistan, and perhaps by extension of Russia, because, as I said, they are capable of carrying out attacks beyond the borders of Afghanistan. The question again is, you're right that the United States is not directly involved in Central Asia as much. But Afghanistan is a domain where NATO is still involved under a umbrella of what is called RS, or Resolute Support. The US is involved, and the idea is to strengthen the Afghan government, the Afghan national government, Afghan National Army, and supporting them both to fight ISKP, but also the Taliban. And again, I repeat, the US is not against bringing the Taliban into a negotiation, but through the Afghan government, but not strengthening the Taliban, which is what is happening with Russia and Iran, and that is creating a front that perhaps would be detrimental to the to the victory for Afghan state, which is weak to begin with, and also to the US-NATO design there. So, as I said, on one hand, Russia has a rationale, but that rationale becomes very weak when you are supporting a group that is actually against the Afghan state.
Look, you mentioned that because following the security in the Middle East,
Yes.
Within the last 2 years, Russia had become more involved than it used to be like 3, 4, 5 years. We're speaking about Syria and in particular. And you said that the Russian president, he was more tactical, and but now he's becoming more strategical. So what would you mean by that?
What I mean by that, Syria was always traditionally, when the Soviet Union was still intact, Syria was an ally. Soviet Union had a base, and Russia continued to keep those bases, both an air base and a naval base. But now it's beyond that. Russia is for the first time showing military power in action beyond what was the sphere of Russian influence. And the commitment in Syria, although they are not as successful as some claim, but the commitment is a long-term strategic commitment to stay in the Middle East, specifically Syria, but also to influence things in Iraq, in Iran. They have had we know that they had landings in Iran. Whether there's a base or not, that's questionable, but near Hamadan in southern Iran, they actually landed aircraft, which is very, very, very rare for Iran. Iran traditionally does not allow a foreign country to use its territory for military activities, but they did, and they initially denied it, but later on they accepted it. So this shows a Russia that is now coming into Syria beyond the traditional aspect of having a ties with the Assad father and then Bashar al-Assad. And as I said, the fact that they actually committed troops, they are fighting on the side of Bashar al-Assad, and that shows a strategic commitment to perhaps stay there for a longer term, have a footprint, not only militarily but also politically in Syria, by extension in Lebanon, in Iran. They're all attached to each other, and that gives Russia a say in the Middle Eastern affairs as a whole, which we have never seen since the end of the Cold War. This is the first time that they're coming in with a voice within. They're now talking to the Egyptians, and they're even talking about maneuvers. They're trying to sell weapons, even to the Saudis and Emiratis. So they're trying to come back as what the Soviet Union used to be, and that's very new.
No, there are two types of thoughts about Russian, not just foreign policy, but and the Kremlin itself. Some people would say we underestimate them, we don't look to how strong they are. Others would say, no, we are actually creating this myth which Vladimir Putin likes, to be stronger than he is. Look at the Russian economy, look at the Russian military. They are uncomparable to NATO, they are uncomparable to to any other country, and they are not as good as they would like to look like, but we're creating the kind of somebody very big. So what would be your explanation?
Look, the fact that they are in Syria shows that they have a power to extend their forces but at the same time, the success in Syria is, again, how you look at success in Syria. They have propped up the regime of Bashar al-Assad. They have been, they have taken some territory, but they're not targeting neither ISIS. They're targeting the same groups that the United States and others support. They're also playing a very, very interesting game with Turkey. How they're reacting, for example, with the Kurds. They're not hitting the Kurds, but they're trying to have a voice. The footprint, you see, the military footprint is not very successful. And you're right, some people exaggerate it, but that's how, when you put a military unit on the ground, you take advantage of that. That's nothing new. I don't think that they have the power to extend beyond what they have done, and even right now. And if you come in there, some people even say that Russia's bombing attempts, they were not very successful, but still to show that they have weapons is almost a way to show that, look, we have weapons that work, and it's a marketable commodity. So whether this is a successful or not successful, the voice is there. And I think that in itself is a step forward, if you would, at this strategy of becoming a partner or a player. I would say player more in the Middle East. They're partners with Syria. With Iran, the partnership is as much as people think about it. I don't think the Iranians trust the Russians as much. But right now, it's a need-based acceptability of both sides. I don't think there's a strategic relationship between Moscow and Tehran, even though they say there is. I don't think the Iranians trust the Russians. But right now, they don't have a lot of other friends in the region, so that's the only way to go to. So the fact, again, remains, how successful or not, they're there. And the fact that they're there, they're affecting, and they're winning, at least in Syria, and the fact that Aleppo, some people don't see Aleppo as a winning, but Russia's taken credit for Aleppo, at least partially. And the fact that Bashar al-Assad is right now walking in the streets of Damascus almost as a victor, look here, there's peace. That gives Russia enough leverage. And very interestingly, within the so-called Arab street, meaning the Arab populace, all the bombings and all the killings you saw in Aleppo, somehow Russia was still liked. Whereas another country would have done that, United States or even another European country, you would have seen demonstrations against it. But somehow Russia's system is still effective, that when they are even attacking civilians, civilian convoys, they are not being reprimanded, at least on the popular arena.
And then where NATO comes in this relations with Russia and strengthening itself in current political situation with Trump as the U.S. president. So, as a Ukrainian, what we are seeing for the last 3 years, NATO got, let's say, more united in some cases. It's still, of course, if you look to what they say, it's a steady support to the sovereignty of Ukraine, for instance. You, as somebody who really may assess it from also not just political but military side, how do you see that?
I personally think NATO is pretty healthy. I mean, we just expanded by one country. So if you look at it that way, that is a victory. That's an expansion of NATO. Article 5, I think President Trump openly said what he had said initially, that he thinks NATO it's a valuable asset and that there's a commitment to it. And I think there's domestic politics sometimes that come in there, but I don't think U.S. commitment to NATO has diminished. And perhaps one maybe a positive side effect, if you would be that there would be more participation by the NATO members who were not going into that 2% agreement, which NATO agreed. So perhaps it actually, in the longer run, NATO may be more strengthened.
What does it mean in practice, and particularly in Eastern Europe, let's say? Like even having a Montenegro as a new NATO member, what does it mean in practice?
That's a good question. I mean, Montenegro is a new member state. It is more, NATO is not just a military alliance. There is an issue of commitment to certain standards. The military standard, perhaps some of the countries are not the same. This is why the 2% is even there. That yes, we understand that there are states, we being collective, this organization of participation in NATO is by a volunteer basis. So what you have is you have a collection of countries that when they got together initially was because of a Soviet threat. And that threat, when it went away, the rationale, the raison d'etre of NATO may have become weaker. That's why Afghanistan became almost like a savior of NATO. I think Russia's position, specifically after takeover of Crimea and what is happening today in eastern Ukraine, may actually have strengthened NATO, even for those countries that thought it wouldn't work. These realizations don't happen overnight. But I think in deep down, when you see what is happening with NATO in countries, the frontier countries, in Poland and Romania and Norway, there's much more attention to it. Commitment to NATO has not diminished. Where commitment has never been up is on how much you put on the table. It's not just force integration, but it's also an issue of what you put in there for this collective defense. So I personally, I think NATO is becoming more valuable, not less. It may not be seen today, but in the next few years, with the actions, specifically in the country that I'm sitting here right now, these actions have affected Europe, specifically Europe, in a way that they think, okay, we have to have some kind of because no single European country can withstand even the potential of a Eastern threat. I'm not saying that would happen, but even the threat of some kind of an aggression. So at the end of the day, I think NATO may become more stronger. And Montenegro shows that why countries want to become there, because they're looking for a collective defense rather than singular defense. But if there's collective defense, there should be collective responsibility. That's what's happening.